Falling out of love with something is rough, especially when your creative outlet is tied to that thing you fell out of love with. Staying topical, staying part of the conversation, it's that level of obligation that turns fun into chores. But this is a unique problem to have. It's not quantifiable. Burnout happens to everyone, and saying I lack passion for this series doesn't make a good video. When I see Fire Emblem Engage, I don't think about my own burnout. I ask myself, why on earth was this the follow-up to Three Houses? Well, you could start with the reviews, fundamental problems like the lackluster story, or the character design being hit and miss at best. And while those are worthy critiques, it doesn't answer the question I posed in that cold open. Why was this the follow-up to Three Houses? Like anything, there's a simple answer. Three Houses was joint developed by Koei Tecmo in parallel to Engage, so the teams were each making their idea of a follow-up to Fates, and the development cycle saw Engage come out second. Case closed. Except, Engage wasn't meant to be a follow-up to Fates, and neither was Three Houses. Both games were coming off the heels of Echoes, a game which many veteran fans of the series considered a revitalization of the storytelling chops after Awakening's undercooked but serviceable narrative, and Fate's already dubious plot getting butchered by the localization. Three Houses picked up where Echoes left off with the complex character drama and delivered on a lot of the standards Echoes set, while also exploding in popularity thanks to the massive install base of the Switch. If you can say Awakening saved the series, you could rightly argue that Three Houses made it a legitimate AAA Nintendo mainstay. You can trace a good deal of DNA from the Three Houses time-skip designs to the look of Echoes. Even with the change in key artists, the outfits are toned back from the truly out-there flourishes and greebles of Fates and Awakening to a more subdued but still modern fantasy Japanese art style. So, what about going from Three Houses to Engage? Oh, well, if you go back a few years to when Three Houses was still at the peak of its popularity, some very early screenshots and information about Engage leaked on social media. I recall the reactions to this being negative initially, not surprising given the climate of the internet in general, but these were undercut with a sentiment that I think was truly earnest. People were worried about the aesthetics. Many were hoping it was fake purely because they couldn't believe our follow-up to Edelgard would have a Pepsi wolf cut. But lo and behold, that's exactly what we got. For lack of a better word, Engage looks glossy. The colors are incredibly bright and in your face. They are hyper-saturated to an almost garish degree. Engage was developed in parallel to Three Houses, and was therefore intended to be Intelligent Systems' next fully in-house game after Echoes. So, let's compare Ivy and Sonya. Two characters who both riff off a Fire Emblem archetype, one game apart, and one that's near and dear to my heart, the hot goth mage lady. Despite having similar figures and silhouettes, Ivy is just so much more over-designed than Sonya, with way more accessories and a much broader and brighter color palette despite the moodiness of her character that's supposed to inform her main joke. Sonya intrigues you whilst Ivy demands your attention. And here's the kicker. I think Ivy is one of Engage's best character designs. This cast just does nothing for me. There's no cohesion. While many of the Fates outfits were also horrendously over-designed, there was at least a high aesthetic consistency from characters in each nation that Kozaki brought to the table. And at a glance, characters could easily be sorted into their factions with just a little bit of visual language. Engage has none of that. Seriously, if you have no knowledge of this game, I dare you to guess which of these four characters are from the same faction. Then you pile up things like the anachronistic alternate outfits present in the home base segments, the Engage rings creating even more out there designs and color combinations and maps, and at some point it crosses from quirky to immersion and genre breaking. First impressions are everything, and if your first impressions of a game are these misguided aesthetic choices, it's going to be very hard for people to get past that. But wait, I hear you cry in the comments. And please do cry in the comments, it's good for the algorithm. Shouldn't the gameplay matter more? And that, dear viewer, is what brings me to the meat of this video. Aesthetics can be ignored if the gameplay foundation is solid, but let's examine that statement. What is the gameplay foundation of Engage? What is the appeal? Or more broadly, what is Fire Emblem? No, seriously, what is Fire Emblem? Okay, sure, it's a strategy RPG, but I mean more in the sense of what type of person plays Fire Emblem? What's the intended market? RPGs are an extremely broad genre. Even if you just narrow it down to JRPGs, that puts Bowser's Inside Story, Pokemon, Earthbound, Final Fantasy, and Persona all in the same bin, when those games have wildly different tones, goals, and so on. So where does Fire Emblem even exist in that ecosystem? Because I think if we find that answer, we can find out why a copy of Engage never made its way into my Switch. The original Fire Emblem released on the Famicom in 1990. It was quite revolutionary for the time. While I have no hard evidence of this statement, I think it was initially positioned as Nintendo's first-party flagship RPG series meant to compete with Square's Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy games, as well as the up-and-coming Phantasy Star series by home console rival Sega. Arguably, that's the niche Fire Emblem filled all the way through the Super Famicom as well. And since JRPGs didn't take off in the West, Nintendo was seemingly content to compete on the home front for the JRPG market. The rest, however, is a tale as old as time. Marth and Roy's inclusion in Melee led to the localization of Fire Emblem 7 in 2003, after the series had moved to handheld following the departure of series director Shozo Kaga. While Fire Emblem traded blows with its Squaresoft rivals on the SNES, we were now in a post-Final Fantasy VII world, and Square had largely ascended to become its own untouchable juggernaut. Fire Emblem's declining sales and failure to truly take off on the West left it poorly positioned as Nintendo's once flagship dedicated JRPG series, especially as Pokemon exploded and captured a much larger demographic and had no competition in the creature collector field. Eventually, Intelligent Systems is given an ultimatum to deliver a minimum amount of unit sales or be forced to can the series, and they make Fire Emblem Awakening, a soft reboot of the series which aesthetically leans into the booming resurgence of fantasy anime due to light novel adaptations that were popular at the time. Thanks to good word of mouth, a system which lacked a big JRPG, as Pokemon was still 10 months away at the time of Awakening's release, and it became a breakout success. Fire Emblem's new niche had been found. It was the handheld JRPG series that served as a complement to Pokemon that skewed to an older audience, the Zelda to Pokemon's Mario in a sense, though things got a little weird when the Switch came along. From an economic perspective, the Switch was a genius move. Nintendo had been floundering in the home console department after the Wii, as they were a half generation behind in terms of power, whilst they stood basically uncontested in the handheld market. Merging the two sectors of their business was attractive to consumers, as it meant Nintendo fans now got access to the full library of new releases with a single purchase. But from a developer's point of view, it left several franchises which had been exclusive to one side or the other in an awkward spot. For cross-platform franchises like Mario and Zelda, it was business as usual. But Fire Emblem was in that exact spot of being a predominantly handheld franchise. Their last few home console offerings performed very poorly, and they now had to contend with Xenoblade, another rags-to-riches first-party JRPG franchise which had become the flagship JRPG for Nintendo's home console division. So, if Xenoblade is going to wipe the floor with you when it comes to storytelling, and Pokemon is going to massacre you in terms of sales and casual appeal, what do you do? Obviously, you lean hard into the gameplay. See, here's where we get into speculation territory, and I get to talk about a suspicion I've had for a while now. Beginning with Awakening's reclassing and child system, something changed with the optimal strategy to approach Fire Emblem. In the older games, you were limited by what the game handed you. Your moment-to-moment strategy and which units were picked were crucial to your success. Unlike other JRPGs, there was very little, if any, build crafting in Fire Emblem. The structure of the game's maps also meant there was a theoretically limited amount of EXP in the game, limiting grinding to rare instances like arena abuse in most titles. Some, like Sacred Stones, bucked that trend, but it became a series mainstay again with Awakening, Fate's Conquest being the only really outlier to this change. In my previous design dissection video, I hit upon this subject as well, in that the higher emphasis on build crafting necessitated the crushing length of the monastery section in Three Houses. But there is one key difference between what Three Houses and Engage had to offer. The build crafting system is not what made Three Houses the success it was. Three Houses was successful because Fire Emblem had built an insane amount of momentum thanks to Fate's and Awakening's runaway success. Echoes won back the veterans, and going into the Switch, Three Houses looked to appeal to both crowds while also returning to home console at a time well between Xenoblade games. Three Houses was unsurprisingly a runaway success of its own and drew a massive influx of new fans to the series as well. If you're sick of Three Houses dominating Fire Emblem discourse, I don't blame you. But the truth is, Three Houses is a damn good game with a solidly written narrative, a fantastic cast, and theoretically, an insane amount of replayability thanks to the story paths and customizable build crafting. But as I said before, that build crafting is not enough to counter the slog of the monastery on repeat runs for players like me who are not overly excited about the build crafting aspect. And because the monastery is so unchanged per path, it leaves number go up as the only thing to keep your attention on repeat runs. I've become insanely addicted to Balatro over the last year, a game where the entire appeal is to have number go up and craft a build of jokers. But as a roguelite, a single run of Balatro can be completed in about a half hour. Whereas for a JRPG like Fire Emblem, that's the length of a single early game map most of the time. Often in modern Fire Emblem, builds don't come together until the mid to late game, since the skill system skews to have the best skills available to the Tier 2 and Tier 3 promoted classes. This often means the first 10 or so hours of gameplay are set up where the story needs to pick up the slack of the lack of your build coming together. Which brings us back around to Fire Emblem Engage. Here is a game with a dubious presentation at best, a lackluster story that gets a shrug from reviewers, who mostly note it as a shallow retread of Awakening. And I can only think back to the marketing for this game. Every direct, they featured previews for Fire Emblem Engage. They focused on things like the home base minigames, the Engage mechanics, the classes, and so on. I looked at this game like it was a second Seal simulator in a coat of fluorescent paint, and I thought to myself, this can't be it, can it? Three Houses' runaway success not only brought in a bunch of new fans to the series, it established expectations. In a similar vein, when Awakening came out, the veterans who expected a certain caliber of storytelling found Awakening didn't deliver. And while with time I think Awakening's story has aged very well in retrospect, at the time, there was an extremely believed dip in quality. So, in comes Three Houses, and it brings it in the story department. If you're a brand new Fire Emblem fan who started with Three Houses, your expectations are that you get from Fire Emblem a good, meaty JRPG story with multiple routes on top of a strategy game with incredibly deep build crafting. And Engage is only half of that game you fell in love with. Thanks for watching. Please take this video with a huge grain of salt. I'm expressly laying out why I did not play this game, so I am quite literally judging a book by its cover here. I think poor aesthetics, unappealing gameplay loop based on the marketing material, and word of mouth that the story is bad are all perfectly legitimate reasons to not buy a game. However, I am entirely prepared to eat my words on this. So if you are a massive Engage fan, sound off in the comments and tell me what you love about the game. While you're at it, check out the videos on screen that YouTube thinks you may like. And if you want to stick around, hit that like and subscribe button. Cheers.